Hi, I'm Steve Schindler.
I'm Katie Wilson-Milne.
Welcome to the Art Law Podcast, a monthly podcast exploring the places where art intersects with and interferes with the law.
And vice versa. The Art Law Podcast is sponsored by the law firm of Schindler, Cohen & Hochman, LLP, a premier litigation and art law boutique in New York City.
There was that element of, great excitement coupled with complete fear in terms of kind of the very live nature of that performance. And that's something which has always appealed to me as an auctioneer. There's a very live entertainment kind of perspective of that role.
Katie, I received some feedback on the podcast from listeners this weekend. And one of the comments that was made to me was with respect particularly to the Berkshire Museum deaccessioning episode, that this listener didn't think that we were necessarily impartial enough or that we were taking sides. And I thought about that a little bit, and one of the things that I feel is that we're not journalists, we're not pretending to be journalists, and we have points of view, and I think we're going to express them. What I think is also important, though, is where possible to have people on with different points of view, and we're very open to that. So I would say if somebody from the Berkshire Museum who listened to our podcast, a representative or a member of the Board of Trustees would like to come on and present their point of view in conversation with us.
We would love that.
We would love that. Similarly, with respect to the 5 Points episode, we spent a lot of time with the artists and people involved in 5 Points, but certainly if Mr. Wolkoff wants to come on and talk about what motivated him
to develop the site,
we're happy to have him on and have the conversation. We will still have the same viewpoints that we have, but we certainly would like to engage with people who have other viewpoints.
Right. And our goal with this podcast is to raise interesting issues that people may not have thought about in the way we talk about them, that connect the art world and the legal world. But it's not to provide a completely even-handed news article about these topics. It's to have an interesting discussion between mostly the two of us, and we are who we are, and we think what we think. I think actually it may evolve over time depending on who we talk to, how we present certain issues. We're also constrained by the guests who come on the show, and we want to be respectful of those guests by honoring their opinions and what they have to say.
So if you want to come on the show,
send us an email.
Let us know.
So, Steve, on this month's podcast, we're going to talk about auctions. We have the May auctions coming up at the big houses, Christie's, Sotheby's, and Phillips, both in New York and in other international locations, mainly London, in early May. So it's a good time to talk about this. Auctions tend to dominate the art world, both in terms of the publicity they get, the prices that come out of auctions, and obviously they're public in a way that private sales are not. So it's an exciting topic.
And we're going to be joined on our podcast by the Sotheby's auctioneer, Oliver Barker, who is one of their top auctioneers in the area of contemporary art.
Yeah, so he is going to give us an insider's view on what it feels like to be at an auction, what an auction house like Sotheby's does to prepare for a big auction, and what he notices has changed over time in the auction world. So to back up and give our listeners a little bit of background, the art market itself is said to be worth between $40 to $60 billion right now. Auction sales from the main auction houses, which are Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips, make up about $11 billion of that. That was the figure in 2017. Only beat, I think, by the results in 2007, which were over $12 billion. So it's a big chunk of the overall art market takes place at art auctions in these three big houses. The biggest group of auction sales take place in the United States, although the auctions in London and in Hong Kong are also incredibly significant in terms of the profile of works that are sold and the types of buyers that are there. One thing that makes auctions interesting is how psychological the selling format is. So unlike a private sale where a dealer, whether it's Sotheby's or at a gallery or private dealer, will call a client or a contact and say, look, I have this work for sale. Here's what the seller will take for it. At an auction, you get the atmosphere of people bidding against each other, which seems to have great psychological effect. And there have been sales in the recent past that have taken off tremendously and sold for way more than anyone could have imagined. The most famous example of that is the Salvator Mundi Da Vinci sale at Christie's that happened last November, where we had two buyers in the end bidding against each other, and the work ultimately sold for around $450 million, which is far and away the most expensive work that's ever sold at auction, ever, right, Steve?
Right, and in that case, you had two buyers who were bidding against each other, who each thought that they were bidding against somebody else,
right,
as it's been reported, and so it drove the price up even higher than anyone even contemplated.
Because of who those two bidders were.
Sure.
So the story is actually pretty interesting, right? We found out after the auction that the ultimate winner of the work was a Saudi prince, and he had been bidding against a friend actually from the United Arab Emirates who wanted the work for the new Louvre in Abu Dhabi. They both thought they were bidding against someone from Qatar instead of each other. When they found out that they weren't and they were bidding against each other, which is the only reason it went for $450 million, they apologized to each other, and the Saudi prince said, oh, actually, you can take the work for the new Louvre in Abu Dhabi in exchange for a yacht. So it actually all worked out, and the great anxiety about that sale, which is that this masterpiece would go into private hands, now resolved, and hopefully it'll be seen at the Louvre Abu Dhabi.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that whole transaction means for art or auctions, but it was amusing.
But it happened.
But from the point of view of a seller, you see these incredible bidding wars for certain kinds of objects, but the auctions can be a little bit terrifying for a seller because you never know what the market is going to be on any given night. You know, at least if you're selling a work at a gallery, you have a lot more control over the situation, that you can wait until a buyer comes along at the price that you're asking. But in an auction, one possibility is that the bidding is good and strong and you get a very good price. The other possibility is that there isn't any bidding that night for a variety of reasons, and the work is publicly not sold.
Right. So unlike a private sale where something isn't sold, well, you just wait and you sell it later. But at an auction, if it doesn't go well, that can really taint the marketability of the work.
And now the rules require that the auction houses announce that a work has not been sold, and then the word that's used for it sometimes is that the work is burned and then can't really be sold, at least not at auction, for some period of time.
I would totally take advantage of a burned work if I
Yeah,
could.
well, of course, and the auction houses then do try to sell the work privately afterwards, and sometimes they know, because they know who the bidders are, what the interest is, and they're able to broker a sale immediately after the auction.
Just maybe not for as high a price as they could have before. So, Steve, we've talked a little bit on this podcast, and certainly between ourselves, about the level of, or lack of, regulation in the art market, and sort of the increasing concerns over transparency, either in terms of money laundering or just transparency about the provenance of a work. Auctions do function a little bit differently than private sales, right? I mean, there's more transparency, if not complete transparency.
Well, auction houses are much more regulated than private sales, and
which are not regulated at all.
Which are not regulated at all, and there is certainly a lot more transparency in an auction process. I'm not sure that we can say that there's 100% transparency, but there are a lot of rules that the auction houses have to comply with, and they do comply with, that at least ensure a certain fairness and openness in the process.
But one of those things is not who the seller is often, right? That's the one thing that's still not transparent at all.
That's right. And there was a case that went all the way up to the Court of Appeals a few years ago. In New York, where we had a buyer at an auction who decided that he didn't want to pay for the work after the fact and challenged the auction house rules on the theory that there needed to be a written disclosure of the identity of the buyer. And actually that case went up to the highest court in New York, and in the court below, much to the unhappiness of the entire auction industry, the court below actually found for the purchaser and invalidated the sale because there was no written record of who the seller was. And the Court of Appeals decided to overturn that, much to the relief of the auction industry.
Yeah, there have been efforts over time to require dealers to disclose the identity of the seller to the buyer, but those have not been successful. The art world seems somewhat allergic to the idea of disclosing who the owner of a work is.
There are really two big secrets now at an auction. One is sometimes who the owners are. I mean, not at every auction. Sometimes it's, in fact, a huge selling
Like the big
point.
Rockefeller sale coming up.
Right, exactly. So the provenance of those works is incredibly important to the value, but sometimes collectors don't want the world to know what they're selling, and so they insist that their identities be kept private, and often those works are offered as the works of a private collector or a European collector or an American collector. And the other big secret at auction is this reserve price.
So what is the reserve price?
Well, the reserve price is the secret price that's agreed to between the seller or the consignor of the work and the auction house, and it's the price below which the work cannot be sold. And what's not a secret and what has to be disclosed is the fact that there is a reserve, and that is clearly disclosed in all auction catalogs. And typically in the major auction houses, they disclose that all of the sales are with reserve unless they say otherwise. And the other thing that means is that in the way that the auction is conducted is that the auctioneer is allowed to submit bids on behalf of the seller up to the secret reserve price.
Why would they do that?
Well, it's really, some people have criticized the practice. The practice is sometimes called chandelier bidding, on this idea that the auctioneer is sort of taking bids off the
ceiling,
chandelier
yeah.
and the ceiling. But really, it's just a question of creating some theater and drama, because up until the reserve price is hit, the work can never be sold. So even if the auctioneer is engaging in some bidding up to the reserve price, until you hit the reserve price, it really has no real impact except to sort
Confuse everyone about what the reserve is.
or to warm up the room if you're taking it from the auctioneer's perspective.
So how does the concept of a reserve interact with this other concept of a guarantee, and what is a guarantee?
Well, a guarantee, which is often used now by major auction houses to entice collectors of works to consign the works to them, is basically a contract, a promise by the auction house to pay a set amount of money to the consigner of the works, regardless of what happens at the auction and regardless of whether the reserve price is hit.
So the seller knows 100% they're going to get at least that amount of money.
Right. Sometimes that's important to a seller. The thing that the seller normally gives up when they agree to take a guarantee is some of the upside of the auction if the price goes above the guarantee and the reserve price.
So the auction house would split the profits above the guarantee.
Yeah, in some proportion. And very often now the auction houses, if they're giving a guarantee, will, in a sense, syndicate that risk to other parties who put up the money and are willing to make the guarantee.
So it's a third party that, if the bidding didn't go higher than the guarantee price, they'd take the work.
They would take the work at whatever price they guaranteed it at. Most of the individuals or institutions that give guarantees would prefer not to have the work. What they're doing is making a financial bet that the work will sell at a price that is higher than the guarantee, in which case they receive a return on their investment.
So Steve, let's talk to an auctioneer who actually works at these big night auctions and see what they have to say about how they work. Our guest today is Oliver Barker. Oliver is a senior director at Sotheby's Auction House and co-chairman of Sotheby's Europe. He is also one of the auction world's foremost auctioneers, so he is both behind the scenes and in front of the cameras at Sotheby's, which he joined in 1994, moving through roles in contemporary art as a senior international specialist, among others. He has overseen some market-defining auction sales, including 2 major sales of Damien Hirst works, including the one that set the world record for a single artist sale. He has a particular interest in post-war British art, which he has promoted at Sotheby's. And he was the auctioneer at the May 2017 auction, in which a Basquiat work sold for a record-breaking $110.5 million.
Welcome to the podcast, Oliver. So what kind of skills do you think a good auctioneer has?
I think numeracy is important. I think a good presentation. I think someone who is very engaging. I think somebody who very much acknowledges physically the body of people in the room that are taking part in participating within the auction. I think also increasingly the online audience, albeit you can't see them, they can obviously see you, the auctioneer, so that's also very important to project oneself in a very meaningful way to people watching in virtual space. I think also, that capacity to kind of read what might happen in terms of one's colleagues and, the involvement of colleagues in terms of telephone bidding or execution of commission bids as well. So it's a bit, other colleagues have talked about how it's analogous to conducting an orchestra, and I think that's a very accurate representation. I think it's very much kind of the focal point of a very kind of group participation activity.
Do you still feel a nervous rush when you're presiding over an auction, or have you gotten used to it over time?
Well, I think it's like any kind of live performance. I mean, I think no matter how well you know your lines, obviously each environment, particularly in our case, auction room, is quite distinct from the next. So there is always a great sense of anticipation and nervousness, but I think equally it's like being an actor. I mean, I think if you didn't have that sense of nervous excitement going on stage, then I don't think you could actually kind of project oneself. And, ultimately it's a great responsibility, and it's that capacity to want to kind of give a great performance as well.
So I think the first thing you said, Ollie, was numeracy, if I heard you correctly. And maybe you could just elaborate a little bit on what that is and why it's important as an auctioneer.
Yeah, well, in any given sort of auction, obviously the auctioneer's role is to try and help proceed the trading from the consignor to the purchaser. So the ability to remember without slavishly looking down at kind of the auctioneer's book, which is obviously there as a working tool during an auction, exactly what the estimate is for a particular work, and also its protective reserve price, and therefore also kind of the opening bid. There's a number of kind of key financial things at play. Equally, there are so many means of bidding in this sort of modern day. So I suppose most traditionally the easiest way to bid is actually in the room, whether it's a private client or whether you choose to bid through an agent who is sitting there executing bids on your behalf. There are also kind of the execution of bids via the telephone through a Sotheby's representative. There may also be commission bids, and the commission bids are always ones which are lodged in the auctioneer's book. So whilst starting off on a particular, you hear auctioneers say footing, the auctioneer's footing, one has to be aware of where the reserve price is, where a commission bid might be, and more importantly, where the commission bid ceiling is, whilst also kind of orchestrating multiple bids that may come in, depending on what the level of interest is in a particular lot.
So we definitely want to ask you about the stages of an auction, so we're going to get back to a lot of the items you just mentioned, but maybe first we should ask you to explain to our audience how you decide what goes into an auction versus a private sale. I mean, big houses like Sotheby's and Christie's do both. Maybe there's a movement towards more private sales now. So what is the determination of what goes up for auction and what doesn't?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think at the moment, because the market is ostensibly very strong, and particularly in the area of contemporary art with which I'm most focused, I think we have the luxury in contemporary to a great extent actually curate the auctions that we're handling. In other words, there are far greater, more voluminous supplies of great objects of the post-war period, which is how we loosely define contemporary, than there might be, say, of old master kind of masterpieces. We use our global network and the conversations that we're having with museum curators or dealers or gallerists or collectors to really have a insider knowledge, if you like, of who the artists that are being sort of collected and who are in high esteem at a particular moment, but then also amongst those artists' works, what are the key periods or what are the most rare objects and what are the ones that the market has seen a real hiatus of. And quite quickly you sort of figure out that, okay, you have the real estate of a certain amount of exhibition space prior to an auction. You have the real estate of a Sotheby's catalogue, which is a major marketing tool that we use, but equally is one that takes a huge amount of laborious work in preparing. One has the audience's attention span, which generally doesn't last beyond a certain amount of time. And then also you have key experience. So we tend to have in an evening sale context probably not more than about 75 lots. That would probably be your maximum. I mean, there's no hard and fast rule, but I think much beyond 75 lots, it's hard to keep an audience's attention and focus. But at the same time, you want to be able to curate a sale so that there are lesser value things, but which are going to be surefire sellers. And you want to also pepper the ordering of the catalog, which is also particularly critical, to introduce the higher value lots at the commercially most optimum moments. And I think at the end of the day also, we're getting very closely judged both by Wall Street and by the collector community in terms of how many unsold lots we're handling. I think it's fair to say that it's a rarity to have sales which are 100% sold. When putting a sale together, one intends to try and sell everything as best one can, but market forces, obviously, in a variety of different reasons, may mean that things go unsold. But there may well be, through price expectation or physical condition issues, problems of some sort of conservation, for example, that on the day the market turns its back. So we would like to have a fairly tidy, trim, unsold rate, obviously, if the percentage is low as possible.
Maybe talk us through sort of setting the stage of what it's like, the atmosphere is like at one of the big evening contemporary art auctions that you preside over.
No, the big auctions really are, an amazing spectacle. I think it's fair to say that the evening sales are very much the summation of a very intensive 3-month period since the last set of auctions, and in many cases the fruition of many years of engagement with a particular collector, meaning that we have put together an auction of what we believe to be the finest works of art in that particular sales season. So there's a tremendous sense of anticipation from a number of different perspectives, whether it's the vendors, whether it's the market itself responding to the quality of the objects that we are offering, whether it's the people within the room itself, in other words, the people who attend, whether they be private collectors or consigners or potential purchasers. From Sotheby's perspective, obviously, there are the management and the financial expectation of the sales. There may even be our shareholders or our board members or even Wall Street that are looking in as well. So I think it's fair to say that there's quite a lot of eyes coming from many different disciplines, all of whom are focused very clearly on that start time of 7 p.m. when we kick off. And being in a live business as we are, it's very exciting that all of our pre-sale marketing is conditioned, obviously, to that deadline and approaching that kickoff point, so that we have done our absolute utmost on behalf of the vendor to reach out to the world's collectors. And I think it's interesting in previewing the next major sale season in New York in May, where there are so many superlative objects that are coming to market at the same time. You'll find that the orchestration of marketing these sales, and therefore how well the auction does, is really crucial in making sure that the world's global collecting community is very, very focused on participating and being focused from the off at 7 p.m. when we kick off that sale.
So what do you do in the lead up to an auction? What are the key things you do to drive up interest in the sales ahead of time?
There are kind of 3 elements, I suppose, in terms of how we best raise interest and therefore kind of the excitement around a particular object, and particularly trying to get somebody to actually kind of participate in and bid in an auction. First of all, there's the announcement of the sale itself, and actually normally that is the sale catalogue. So that's the very first time that the market's actually been able to have a very holistic view on all the objects that we're going to be selling at that particular moment. Sometimes preceding that, sometimes following that, are a series of well-orchestrated marketing campaigns, which might include taking a particularly important object to Hong Kong, for example, and actually I think a very good example is the announcement today, in fact, of the wonderful Modigliani nude of 1917, which we've actually launched online in a live webcast on Sotheby's.com, but from Hong Kong, with a very deliberate view that, a likely buyer for an object like that may well come from that region of the world. But at the same time, that is an object which will now return to New York to be viewed in the next couple of weeks in a pre-sale exhibition, within our building on New York Avenue. And that's the other key part of the exhibition, or the excitement going into an auction. We have a usually 10-day or sometimes longer, sometimes a little bit shorter preview before a particular sale, which enables collectors to come in and look at the pictures, but I think also most importantly really do due diligence. So talk to experts at Sotheby's, or take their own independent advice, come in with somebody who has a particular knowledge in an artist's work, even seek the opinion of a third-party conservator, somebody who is able to come and look at an object, take it off the wall. In the same way that you wouldn't acquire a house without having a full structural survey on it, collectors do very much the same thing with paintings. I mean, they like to come on board and actually have a look at services reports and get a sense of, is it in the original condition from which it left the artist's studio? Have there been some kind of repaintings? Are there any losses anywhere? And then obviously you lead to the auction itself, and that might be preceded by dinner parties or press releases as well. But as I mentioned a moment ago, obviously the sale tends to kick off at a very particular time. Nowadays, also because our auctions are broadcast online, it's even more important that we kick off in a sort of timely manner. And we've had going on behind the scenes throughout the whole marketing process a number of internal meetings at Sotheby's, which are called interest meetings, which are designed to help orchestrate and choreograph what are the levels of interest that the works of art that we are selling driving in the marketplace. In other words, has that first lot in the sale had the kind of feedback that we thought it might, because it's such a rare object and that it seems to carry comparatively conservative estimates? So in other words, has it driven 3 or 4 people to look as if they're making the signs that they might decide to make a bid on the auction?
So, Ollie, when you start the bidding, you already have a sense, I gather, of who is interested and what level of interest they have.
Well, I think it's fair to say that, auctioneering is a very irrational process. It's not a fixed price. I think to a prospective purchaser of art who's never bought at auction before, there is a certain level of discomfort. I mean, by comparison to walking into a gallery where quite often there is a published price, or, it's known what the end user price might be, and of course, barring any room for negotiation, you've got a fairly clear idea of what you're going to likely pay for a certain transaction. When you walk into an auction, obviously there is absolutely no guarantee that the object is going to be acquirable at a particular level of price, because of course it entirely depends on who ends up bidding against you. Having said that, what we are trying to do is to make the irrational as rational as we possibly can. And in other words, we are using our experience to try and understand what the likely outcome of a particular auction might be. Now, obviously we would love to supersede our expectation and know that on the night, something might double or sometimes triple, or if we've done our jobs correctly and we know we've got a wonderful object and equally it's been well marketed and it's highly desirable in the marketplace, and you have been able to drive great interest in that particular object, you might suddenly find that something will take off and make a really superlative price that has no precedent in the market to date.
How often does that happen, that there's sort of a runaway bidding on a work that just takes everyone by surprise?
Well, I mean, Katie, I wish I could say on every single lot. I mean, it's not like that. But, I think the buyers now are particularly savvy, and I think, we would expect them also to be fully aware and advised of, what comparable objects make in the marketplace. So depending on what you're selling, there may well be one sale. I mean, we had a great example of something which did superlatively well last May when we sold a Basquiat painting for $110 million against an estimate somewhere in the region of just over $50 million. So, that was a really great example of something which completely superseded what our pre-sale expectations were. And
you were presiding over that auction, Ollie, as I remember.
I had the great privilege of holding that auction.
How did that feel at the time?
It was terrifying. I think that because I very much love the entertainment aspect of the auction, it was something which seemed to go very slowly, albeit I think time actually sometimes slows down actually when you're dealing with such high figures, and particularly when the kind of the free sort of excitement of 2 very determined bidders like that kind of really gets going. But it was great privilege. It was a tremendous work of art. I mean, I think also the signs in the pre-sale activities have been that the market, this was the picture the market was really looking for. I mean, I think you had the trilogy of a great object by a great artist, which was entirely fresh to market, really, truly all those kind of elements choreographed together to make a phenomenal price. And I think in fairness, to Sotheby's also, I think we did a tremendous job in terms of marketing that work and just making sure that on the night, the 2 most likely bidders or end users ended up sort of fighting against each other. And there was a real sort of gladiatorial kind of contest which went on between them.
It's really interesting how much of the excitement, I think, of the auction actually happens before the auction, which you've talked about in terms of the sort of press and the social media and the events. And I wonder, has that changed over time, or in your experience?
Well, it's really interesting to me that, with Sotheby's is actually I think we're the oldest company that's listed on the American Stock Exchange. We're a company that was founded in 1744 in London by somebody who was a bookseller. And, I think the reason that we remain, or rather auctioneering remains, a really contemporary activity is that I still think is one of the most effective ways of selling works of art from one entity to another. And I think that, we are fortunate, being Sotheby's and Christie's and Phillips could say very much the same thing, that we are deemed to be kind of very credible marketplaces for the sale of the greatest works of art and the things that we particularly handle. Having said that, I think that, particularly with the new opportunities afforded by the internet and social media, etc., I think the abilities to market what we're selling have grown massively within the last 2 years, and continue to kind of change all the time. I think that we as a business are very much at the forefront in terms of kind of trying to get technical innovation very much front and center in terms of how we get objects sort of into the minds of the prospective purchasers out there. I think it's fair to say that actually auctioneering in a way remains a very, it's quite an old school form of actually selling something. You have a finite amount of time to sell something. It has to be in a particular city. It has to start at a particular time. And you're somewhat reliant on your audience actually being available and focused at that particular moment. Having said that, and again, to use another analogy, I think that race horses tend to run a little bit faster when they can hear the hooves of other horses beside them. And I think very much the same with bidders. I think that there is something very compelling to a major collector to feel that there is competition for a work which very much validates the quality of that particular work. I think in a way, to buy something, against a reserve price or with no other bidder or underbidder can, to a lot of people, actually be a quite difficult situation. It suggests that your taste has not been validated on the day of acquisition.
Then some of the language that you use in an auction also seems adversarial. When you say to a bidder against you, or it's
setting up a competition almost.
I think there are people who are very determined when it comes to auction to actually try and acquire something. So I think the auctioneer's role is very much to help translate that kind of rigorousness on a bidder's behalf to really acquire that trophy and acquire that sort of particular masterpiece. I think I prefer to use the word cajole in a way rather than kind of adversarial. I'm not sure how many bidders are overly adversarial, but if I'm cajoling them well enough, and if that means kind of questioning their virility of bidding, then that's definitely something that we like to kind of use as a means, and I think the audience is very receptive to it as well.
Well, it makes it exciting, and Steve and I, in preparing for this podcast, did some reading about work that's been done on the psychology of the auction, and it's really interesting. People just react completely differently in an auction setting than they would in a private sale, and I was thinking of you sort of as this psychological master leading the auction. Do you think about, do you do any research on that, or how do you think about the psychological?
No, very, very much so. And I think it's very hard to kind of really define it, particularly when you're in a live environment like that. There are examples, and one sticks in my mind probably more than any was when we did the big Damien Hirst Beautiful Inside My Mind Forever sale in 2008. In terms of a pre-sale environment, you could not have got a more heady mixture than the imminent collapse of Lehman Brothers happening during the pre-sale exhibition of that sale, and then the eventual collapse of the bank and the kind of the financial tsunami in the stock exchanges that was the direct result of it, which happened on the 15th of September 2008. And that was the kind of the backdrop to which we then held the sale that evening in London at 7 p.m. So, from the announcement first thing in the morning that the bank, or rather the central bankers in America or New York, had chosen not to support Lehman Brothers, and it fell into administration, you suddenly saw, opening in the Tokyo Stock Exchange, this sort of financial malaise that spread west throughout the day. So by 7 p.m. that evening in London, of course, there was, this was front page news in the Evening Standard, and we were incredibly worried about what would happen and how the transition would affect the auction. But I think it's fair to say that, in any auction environment, there is a kind of vacuum-like opportunity or intensity, if you like, where the outside world is somehow put on hold and people are particularly focused on the auction itself. And I think actually because the auction of Damien Hirst's works was a completely unmitigated success, I think there was an element of, yes, psychosomatically people were very involved and very engaged with those objects, but equally as an auctioneer, I was hopefully able to get their real attention that night. There are no rules. I think ultimately no rules in terms of, what a bidder's limit might be. Depending on what their financial means are. A lot of our bidders are very astute and they come in with a very fixed idea of what they want to spend on a particular object. There may be those who on the night have a particular limit but then blow straight through it, depending on...
I was going to ask you just that, right? Do they stick to it?
Yeah, well, it's, I can only speak from my own experience, when I bid in auctions outside of Sotheby's, quite honestly, you set yourself a limit, and I did this actually buying my wife's engagement ring, I set myself a limit and then I just blew straight through it because it was just an object I had to have. And I think that's also dependent on, the high end of the market, when you're dealing with kind of very unique Rothkos or Modigliani's or Francis Bacon paintings or Picasso's, and you saw it clearly with the Leonardo painting that came up at Christie's. I think in that case, when there is an element of scarcity and rarity and kind of, a one-offness in the marketplace, there's much more likelihood to be a kind of stellar auction price, which will be very hard to replicate.
So, Ali, you've been very generous with your time, and we're sad to let you go, but I would like to ask just one more question before we conclude. You are an auctioneer in London, you're an auctioneer in New York. Is there a difference between auctions held in Europe and the United States or even Hong Kong, just in terms of the atmosphere and the buyers?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think as an auctioneer, I'm very conscious about trying to engage a different audience in a different sort of geographical location. I think that in New York, in particular with the auction room at Sotheby's, it's a vast space. It seats many more people than our London auction room. I think that there are, obviously, the stakes in terms of the values of the works tend to be a lot higher. There's arguably more participation actually from the telephones than there are in any other auction location. And I suppose for me, being based in London, it's a slight cultural nuance just on the basis of being in a different city. But, it's now become very familiar to me. I certainly as an auctioneer, I remember the first time I got up in New York to take an auction, it really felt as if I was sort of entering a tremendous environment, a huge kind of stage, and obviously kind of with works to kind of back that up. I think in London, it's just by definition, our building here is a little bit more quaint, albeit the auction itself is, still to an audience of possibly up to 600-700 people, but I think that one has to be attuned to the kind of the audience that is looking, as well as the people who are likely to be tuning in. It's very difficult as an auctioneer to know exactly who's on the end of a telephone line or who's watching from the comfort of their own home in terms of online bidding, for example. But because there are more numerous ways of actually placing bids these days, we have to be accountable for each possible one.
Great. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us today. I know our listeners will enjoy hearing your perspective.
Thank you, Ollie.
My pleasure. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Katie.
Well, so let's talk about the rules. Rules are obviously exciting to us because we're lawyers.
We're lawyers and we love rules.
Auctions do feel a little bit like the Wild West, right? They're theatrical. You have people acting on impulse. It's really exciting. Bids go up tens of millions of dollars at a time. But there's actually rules to it and regulations. So Steve, what are some of those rules?
Well, there are really two sets of rules that govern auctions in New York. One is the Uniform Commercial Code, which is a code of laws that are adopted across all 50 states that governs the sale of goods. And art is really a fancy kind of good, not any different from the microphones that we're now talking into. So UCC Section 2328 provides a contractual framework for auctions. And it basically says that a contract is formed and a sale is complete when the auctioneer's hammer falls. And there are some specifications in the UCC about what happens, for example, if the hammer is falling.
Right.
And another bid comes in, and the UCC says under those circumstances, the auctioneer has discretion to, in a sense, open up the bidding again. The other thing that the UCC provides are some rules relating to whether or not there's a reserve or not. If an auction goes forward without a reserve price, then once the bidding starts, the lot can never be withdrawn. So if the bidding is $5 or $10, it doesn't matter what the object is worth. At that point, the seller is kind of stuck with it, and when the hammer falls, that's it. If there is a reserve, then of course the object can always be withdrawn from sale unless the reserve is hit. The UCC provides for two kinds of warranties that are important in the purchase of art. One is a warranty of title, and the other is a warranty of authenticity. A warranty of title, whether you're buying from an auction house or from a dealer, is implicit in any sale. The second warranty is a warranty of authenticity. A warranty of authenticity, unlike the warranty of title, has to be express. You need to say what you're warranting in some fashion, and the way that works under the UCC with respect to an auction catalog is if the work is listed in the catalog as the work of a particular artist, that constitutes a warranty
That it is.
that it is the work of that artist, as opposed to other ways of formulating the catalog description, such as something is the school of or in the style of, but whenever it is that you sell something and you list it in the catalog as being the work of an artist, you are, and the auction house is warranting that the work is authentic. Warranties of authenticity and title carry with them a 4-year statute of limitations, but one of the things that the auction house does with respect to its warranty of authenticity is to provide for a 5-year guarantee of the authenticity of the work. So they actually give you 1 more year than you normally get.
Right, so if there's a problem with the work you buy at auction, you can go back to Sotheby's or Christie's within 5 years, pretty much no questions asked, as long as you have some backup for your concern. They'll give you your money back, take the work, and then it's up to them to go to the consignor or the seller to sort things out with them.
Right, and one of the things we know from working with auction houses is that they do a very thorough job on the consignment side.
Well, they have a lot at stake.
They have a lot at stake, and so you know that they are working very diligently to make sure that the works that they're selling have title and that they are what they're purporting to be.
And even if something comes up after the contracts have been signed, after the catalog has been out, if something comes up that one of the auction houses doesn't feel good about prior to auction, they can withdraw the work at their complete discretion. And we've seen that a number of times, that they're really cautious and they'll pull something at the last minute.
Right, and it's a very difficult decision to make because obviously it's not great for the consignor. In New York, the New York City Department of Consumer Affairs also has a set of rules for licensing auctioneers and regulating public auctions. And interestingly, these rules were substantially revised in the 1980s, particularly in the aftermath of a scandal that hit Christie's as an auction house, where a number of works were not in fact sold because reserves were not met. But in order to boost the market, Christie's and its then chairman falsely reported that the works were in fact sold. And after that happened, the chairman of Christie's at the time was forced to resign, and the Department of Consumer Affairs decided that they needed to get a little bit tougher with the regulation of auctions just to make sure that the public would feel secure in bidding at an auction. After their obligations to the vendors and the consignors, which, Katie, I know you will talk about a little bit, the main obligation that the auction house has to the buying public is to really ensure that the bidding is fair and that the sale conditions are transparent and that everybody knows the rules. So a few of the things that were changed at the time that these rules were overhauled was that the existence of the secret reserve price now must be disclosed. Not the amount of it, but the fact that there is a secret reserve price must be disclosed. Also, when we talked about guarantees before, if there is a guarantee that is given on a lot, that also must be disclosed. We know that auctioneers under the rules are never allowed to bid for their own account unless that bidding is disclosed and except up to the reserve price. We talked about chandelier bidding, for example. If there is to be chandelier bidding, it has to be disclosed. And all of these disclosures are normally made in the big auction catalogs.
With little symbols.
With little symbols. When you look at the terms of sales, it goes through all of these types of items and then indicates whether there are guarantees, whether there are financial incentives of any kind being offered to the sellers. And the idea is that this kind of information will help inform the market in their bidding. And sometimes, in fact, when these conditions change, even at the last minute, the auction houses will post notices outside the auction room with any disclosures that have to be made.
So the New York City Consumer Affairs rules also require that there be a written contract for every auction between the auction house or the auctioneer and the seller. Commissions that are charged have to be disclosed. There has to be a disclosure of any interest that the auction house or any related party has in the work, whether they own a part of the work or, have an interest in a guarantee on the work. The auctioneer cannot disclaim warranty of title, even though under some circumstances the UCC would permit that, which is what Steve was just talking about. And the consignor has to make a warranty of title. So there's two ways that the buyer is protected in terms of the title. So there's also this concept in auctions of an enhanced hammer price. And that means in the old model, auction houses made most of their money from consignors paying them a fee. So if I owned a work of art and I went to an auction house and sold it, I would give them a percentage of what I got from the sale. For a variety of reasons, I think mostly, Steve, because of competition among the auction houses to get sellers to consign amazing works, the auction houses for certain clients charge very little, if anything, of a seller's commission. And now they seem to be getting most of their money from what's called a buyer's commission.
And the buyer's premium is something that's set out very clearly in the terms of sale. And the buyer's premium, unlike the seller's commission, is really never negotiable.
The amount of the buyer's premium changes depending on the price of the work, right?
As the price of the work goes up, the percentage of the premium goes down.
Goes down a little bit. And so, but it's even beyond that now, right? So now the competition is so fierce for sellers or consignors that sometimes the auction house will promise the seller a share of the buyer's premium, which is the original fee that's supposed to go to the auction house.
Right, and that's known as an enhanced hammer.
Or under the New York Consumer Affairs laws, rebate. So auction houses are agents. They work for the seller, technically, so they are fiduciary of the seller, not of the buyer. Although the regulations and rules that we just talked about, the UCC and the New York City Consumer Affairs rules, really mostly serve to protect the buyer. So it's sort of an interesting relationship in that it is a fiduciary relationship. The auction house is a fiduciary of the seller, which means that they have to act in the utmost good faith and in the interest of the consignor throughout their relationship, meaning they have to take care of the consigned work. They have a duty to disclose details that influence what the work can sell for, how auctionable it is, if there are any issues that come up in due diligence about the work. Then the proceeds from the auction sales are really held in trust for the seller. They belong to the seller, and the auction house holds them as a fiduciary, meaning it can't use those proceeds for other business purposes. So those basic fiduciary laws exist in the auction consignor relationship, but they are overlaid with practices and rules that come up in the UCC and the Consumer Affairs rules that really make the relationship one towards the buyer as well. And I think this is unique to the auction world, that the auction is facing the seller as a fiduciary, as an agent, and the buyer with all these rules of disclosure that come out.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different than a sort of gallery situation. I mean, there you have the same technical legal relationships. You have a consignor of works to a gallery is in a fiduciary relationship with the gallery owner, and the customers or clients of the gallery are not, but you don't have that same level of regulation governing the sort of practices vis-a-vis the clients.
It seems more clear in the private sale world who is responsible to whom, that the gallery is a fiduciary of either the artist whose work they're selling, or if they take a work from a collector to sell, they are the agent of that collector, and it's a little more clear. In the auction world, there are all these regulations. Some of the practices that seem to conflict with traditional fiduciary-like obligations are guarantees, where the auction house has an incentive to make money on its own account if it can sell a work for above the guarantee, right? And then it's dealing with this potential third party who also has an interest in the outcome of the sale, and it's not the seller.
Right. And I think the other really important fiduciary obligation that the auction house has to the consignor of works is this question of auctionability, of looking at a work and deciding, is this something that should really be in an auction or in an auction this May or November, or is it something that really should be sold privately? Because if you put something up for auction that isn't right, then the consequences to the seller are pretty severe. It's a sort of public shaming of the work, and that is, very difficult for an entity who lives
makes all its money
on selling people's works at auction. So it's a really important fiduciary duty. It's one that I think that the auction houses try to live up to, but it does create a natural tension.
Yeah, and I think we would call these things potential conflicts of interest. The guarantee, the fact that auction houses want things to go to auction even while they're fiduciaries of the seller, and it may not make sense for something to go to auction at a certain time. And then there's the buyer's premium, where the auction house is getting paid by the buyer and is incentivized to sell work at a certain price or at a certain time so that they can get the buyer's commission. And then what about art loans? How do art loans fit into the fiduciary obligations of the house? Well, how do art loans work in the auction?
So art loans now are fairly common. They can either be made by the auction houses themselves. For example, Sotheby's has a significant loan and finance department, and what it typically does is offer advances to consignors who are selling works at an auction. So if I put my work up for auction in May, but it's January and I'd like to have some cash in advance, typically they will loan you 50% of the low estimate. What's problematic here is that if the work doesn't sell at auction, then you still have to pay back the loan. And so I would say that the interfacing of the auction house and their making of the loan, that's not a fiduciary relationship, that is an arm's length relationship, no different than if you went out to a bank or to a special purpose financing company and sought a similar kind of loan.
The borrower is paying interest to the auction house too, so it's a profitable enterprise, theoretically.
And it started out really as an accommodation business. I think it's grown a little bit past that, but the idea would be if you were Sotheby's or Christie's and you were competing for prize consignments, one of the incentives that you would offer your consignors would be an advance.
And now they can make a loan that's in a more traditional lending format and get some interest in the process.
Right.
It sounds like we should do a whole episode on art lending and art finance.
Maybe we should. I think we will.
So another way, or a way that the auction houses and the auction system gets around this potential conflict between fiduciary obligations to the seller and rules of disclosure to the buyer is in their contracts. And as is always true, having a contract that lays out the terms of a relationship is a great idea, and it prevents other legal claims such as breach of fiduciary duty. So it's pretty clear in the law that you can modify fiduciary obligations by contract, and that is just what the auction houses do. So they have consignor agreements with the seller, and they have terms of sale. And both of those are contractual obligations, either between the seller and the auction house, in the case of the consignment agreement, and in terms of sale between all three parties, the auction house, the seller, and the buyer. So what are the main contract terms that are laid out in a consignment agreement in terms of sale? One is the commissions, to make clear who is benefiting from what, that the seller knows there may be a buyer's commission. If they have a share in that or not, that's all laid out. So any potential conflict of interest is disclosed and accepted by both parties. The seller, the consignor, makes representations and warranties with respect to clear title, the ability to sell the work or authority to sell the work if it's an entity selling, authenticity of the work, etc. And the contract will lay out the consequences to the seller if those warranties and reps are not true. And that's because, as we've just said, the auction house has a duty to the buyer which is both governed by the UCC and under the auction house's contractual obligation to take work back within 5 years if there's an issue with authenticity. The contract with the seller means they can go back to the seller and sue them if need be to recover the value they lost from accommodating the buyer.
And what happens now if the buyer doesn't pay? There have been a couple of lawsuits that have been in the headlines lately about buyers who have made bids and then just decided not to pay.
It's kind of incredible to me that that happens, that you could be a high-profile enough bidder to be at a big night auction at Sotheby's or Christie's, that they would vet you financially, which we know they do, and they have to, that's smart, and it would still happen that the buyer's like, no, actually I changed my mind, I'm not going to pay.
So then what happens if you're a seller?
So if you're a seller, the contract says that the auction house is under no real obligation to go and collect money for the sale.
Right.
Like, they're going to do their best to sell it. It's clear, what reps and warranties are being made, but if the auction house doesn't get the money, they can't give it to you. So the seller really does bear the risk of that. Now, both the seller and the auction house may have civil causes of action where they can go after the so-called buyer who didn't pay for a breach of contract. And that is, in fact, what happens. If it's enough money that it's worth it, the auction house will sue.
Right, and even if they don't have a legal obligation to do it, they probably, in order just to preserve the integrity of their auction and to entice other people to sell with them, they need to sometimes enforce the promises of buyers.
They could also have a 20% interest in
That's
the
right too.
sale price, so it might be financially worth it for the auction house too.
Right. And what about, do auction houses now concern themselves with money laundering and source of funds?
They do greatly, and we deal with this a lot. There's increasing oversight, I think, from banks with large amounts of money moving in and out of accounts. So there's some financial regulation, which is not regulation of the art world, though, which overlaps with the art world just because it's about movement of funds. There's also, we know, for Chinese buyers, pretty strict regulations in China with respect to how much money can leave China every year, and it's a really low number. So there are reasons that the auction house is going to want to check into the type of client they're dealing with or the type of potential buyer to make sure that they're not going to get caught up in some kind of regulatory investigation or lawsuit or third-party subpoena where they're going to have to turn over their records and be scrutinized.
So I think it's fair to say, and it's not obvious, that you can't just stroll into a high-profile, auction in the evening for major pieces of contemporary art and pick up a paddle and then just sort of raise it away.
Indeed, no.
That there's a lot of due diligence both on the seller's side and the buyer's side that the auction houses perform, and that's one of the things that...
Before you get the paddle.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's probably something that's changed dramatically and increasingly as the art market has taken off and become, a $60 billion industry, that it becomes harder and harder to take part in one of these auctions because there's too much at stake if you don't pay, or if it's going to get the auction house in trouble. So the contracts that the auction house has with the seller also protects the auction house by providing a broad indemnification from the seller. So just like we were talking about a minute ago, if something goes wrong with the sale, there is a title issue, despite the fact that the seller warranted there wasn't, or there's an authenticity issue, the seller says, I'm going to cover those costs for you, the auction house, including your legal fees. I'll refund you the work. Now, enforcing it is a different matter, but the seller does indemnify the auction house. It doesn't directly protect the buyer. The buyer will still go to the auction house, and the auction house will protect the buyer, but they can then turn around and go to the seller. It also provides that the seller is going to pay certain expenses, that there'll be reserve prices, what happens if the reserve isn't met, that it will be bought in, that it will be announced publicly. And then two of, I think, the most significant contractual modifications of the fiduciary relationship, which are that the auction house maintains until the date of sale the right to rescind in its sole judgment if it thinks there's any liability possible. So it doesn't even have to explain to the seller. It might want to because they want to maintain that client relationship, but the auction house has the right until right before auction to pull a sale for any reason if it feels that there's some liability involved. And they do that.
Right, and sometimes it doesn't seem entirely fair There was a case a couple of years ago involving a consignment of a work by Katie Nolan to Sotheby's.
Right.
And Katie Nolan had, prior to the sale, disclaimed authorship of the work because it had been, in her view, improperly
Was she the
conserved.
consigner, or she?
No, there was
right.
she was not the consigner, but she was
She's
was
the
just
author of the work.
the author of the
Yeah.
work, and we know under the Visual Artists' Rights Act,
If
the
you
author.
listen to our last episode.
Yes, the author of a work has the right to disclaim authorship of the work if she believes that it has been damaged in a way that would reflect poorly on her honor and integrity. And in this case, Katie Nolan had viewed the work, observed that it had been improperly conserved in her view, and publicly disclaimed authorship of the work, at which point Sotheby's felt compelled to pull the work from the auction because it no longer could, in its view, give a warranty of authenticity. That Sotheby's could no longer make the warranty that this was a work of Katie Nolan, even though it was indisputably by her hand. Sotheby's was ultimately sued by the consigner for pulling the work in that way, and unfortunately, because of the contract that you've just referred to, giving Sotheby's the right in its sole discretion to remove a work from a sale anytime prior to the sale, the court sided with Sotheby's. And that's it for today's podcast. Please subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and send us feedback at podcast@schlaw.com. And if you like what you hear, give us a 5-star rating. And finally, we want to thank our fabulous producer, Jackie Santos, for making us sound so good.
Until next time, I'm Katie Wilson-Milne.
And I'm Steve Schindler, bringing you the Art Law Podcast, a podcast exploring the places where art intersects with and interferes with the law.
And vice versa. The information provided in this podcast is not intended to be a source of legal advice. You should not consider the information provided to be an invitation for an attorney-client relationship, should not rely on the information as legal advice for any purpose, and should always seek the legal advice of competent counsel in the relevant jurisdiction.